As I said last time, there will be no lecture on Tuesday, but there will be class on Wednesday. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about today, so far I have been talking about social theory more or less in general, and social theory more or less in the West, European social theory and its legacy in North America. What I want to talk about today is what happens to social theory in East Asia, and also in general about East Asia as the beginning of my series of lectures. From roughly 1840s, the Opium Wars, and thereafter, native traditions of thought in East Asia find themselves in retreat. And certainly after 1868 in Japan, it begins to be eclipsed. And by native theories, I mean largely Chinese and Chinese influenced thought. As I said in passing, they are not really social theory for a number of reasons. They come close occasionally to the political philosophy, certainly moral philosophy. And they're not really social theory, but nonetheless, intellectuals and political leaders in China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan certainly had a set of ideas about how the world worked, how the human world worked. And they're not completely Confucian, even though Western scholars tend to think it was literally Confucian. But nonetheless, the only point I'm making is that from 1840s or so, they become increasingly delegitimated. In effect, what happens is that native philosophies in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam become minor phenomena. And minor in the sense that they become only popular among people who are reactionary in character. By reactionary, I don't mean just right-wing, but I mean people who want to make the society or social life or intellectual life the same as it was before the advent or coming of the West. What happens in so doing is a lot of interesting ideas, beyond Confucius of course, become forgotten for a very long time. And ironically, it's the Western scholars of East Asia who begin to find them interesting, write about them, and get more or less rediscovered. But I'll talk more about this a bit more later, but it's not a very important point. So what happens instead is that one or another form of European and Western social theory become the main way in which East Asians begin to think about their societies. After all, to even think about society meant that you use this Western concept. And as the example of society suggests, almost all the major institutions of social life, political life, and economic life are described in terms of the vocabularies and concepts from the West. So everything from the very idea of the state, the idea of the economy, the idea of society, these are all Western imports. And I'll talk more about this later as well. And what's very curious in some way is that whether you are establishment figures, the Meiji Restoration and the people who tried to create modern Japan, or other reformers, or people who try to criticize the modernizing governments in East Asia, both utilize one or another social theory. And so what I'm trying to suggest is over time, Western social theory becomes hegemonic, becomes the main way in which people in East Asia begin to see what their society is like and what the world at large is like. And so in effect, what I'm suggesting is that there's a one-sided encounter, right? That Western theory begins to be imported to explain, describe and explain Asian reality, but East Asian reality has almost no impact in the way Western theory takes place. And the nature of this intellectual slavery, I would probably call it, kind of subservience, is very, very simple. First comes translation. Translation of Western concepts and categories. So they all become translated into Chinese characters, very often by Japanese, but they get adopted readily by Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese intellectuals. And then, of course, comes the stage of application, meaning that these concepts and categories become the primary way in which people try to describe and explain what goes on in these East Asian societies. People start using even the categories of class, for example, capitalism, and so on. And people who resist this encroachment, either the translation or the application of Western categories and concepts, become marginalized. At best, they are said to do empirical work, kind of non-theoretical work, and so therefore have almost no impact on the way people think about social theory, either in East Asia and almost definitely in Europe and the US. The easiest way I can prove this is simply that no major East Asian theorists have really been translated widely into English or German or French. Occasionally philosophers get translated, but they are seen as curiosities. So if someone tries to bring Buddhist or Zen philosophy, they often get translated, seeing how Zen interacts with Heidegger or something like that. But in terms of social theory, I can't really think of anyone whose work can take it seriously. And so some are translated, so Japanese Marxists, Chinese Marxists get translated, but that's because they were Marxists who wrote about Japan. That is to say, did the second thing, to apply Marxist thought in the Japanese or Chinese case, and therefore the Marxists in the West thought that they had something to say about China and Japan. Okay, so what happens then is a very, very simple story. And though it may seem exaggerated, essentially what happens is this long tradition of Confucian academies or other forms of academies and intellectuals become marginalized and over time disappear. No one takes them seriously. So, for example, if you go to Japan today, you can't even find them. We don't even know who they are. They actually exist, but no one reads them. And this is certainly true in Korea. It's slightly less true in the Chinese language areas, but for reasons I'll talk about probably more later. There's one of the reasons is that they're more kind of reactionaries who write in Chinese language. I'm happy to talk more about this later if you're interested. Meaning that there are people who genuinely believe that you can just bring back Confucius and his thought and apply it to China. Du Weiming at Harvard is the most famous case. And in some ways, he's not really a social theorist, he's just a philosopher and thinks that the world should become like what Confucius said it should be. And of course, what happens is that the central institution that disseminates, spreads this idea is the Western-style university, which begins really in Japan, but immediately gets imported into Korea, Taiwan, of course, largely through colonial relationship, but even in China itself. Not just through Japan, of course, but also through Western intermediaries, mainly missionaries, who try to bring Western science, medicine, and thought into East Asia. And these universities become the major training ground for government bureaucrats, captains of industry, the leaders of mass media, most importantly newspaper, in fact. And so what they learn in their 4 years at university is to think in this new Western way. Right? You use categories and concepts forged in the West that are translated, that become the way people think. And the way we know this is the case is that if you look at categories of staff, the titles, they are basically more or less direct translations of Western titles. And this is true not only in terms of bureaucracies, but also in terms of almost all the major infrastructures of society. And so in a very, very simple fashion, these universities become the main conduit, main pipeline of importing, disseminating, and tweaking, slightly changing Western ideas and concepts to East Asian realities. And most importantly, of course, it's precisely this sort of knowledge that becomes the principal social capital, cultural capital of the new age. That is to say, for a very, very long time in Chinese cultural sphere, I mean, you could essentially measure a person's intellectual worth by how many Chinese characters they use. You must be truly learned because you know 6,000 characters. And also that you can, of course, readily quote from the classics. But this is no longer true, not even in China. The way you show that you are educated, that you must be a great intellect, is by, for example, in the social sciences, knowing the latest trends in Western academic life. So in terms of social theory, you talk about Luhmann from Germany, Perdue from France, Giddens from England. It doesn't really matter who, but it's these people that come, not obviously native thinkers, by and large. I try to stress in some way that Japan becomes quite central in this intellectual enslavement. I mean, it's a very strong word. It's a bit polemical. But there is a real sense in which it just kind of comes without much resistance. People just accept it. In part because there were no alternatives. People just didn't have concepts to make sense of society, for example, or the modern nation state, nationalism, all sorts of things. And one of the main reasons, of course, Japan became so important was that it was the first to begin to do this on a mass scale. But even more importantly, that Japan was successful. It defeated, obviously, kind of nascent, incipient Western threat, but most importantly, of course, it wins wars against China in 1894-95. I mean, this, is quite unthinkable. I mean, today, of course, people don't think anything of it because it happened a long time ago. But if you think about, for example, how Chinese literati, Chinese intellectuals thought about the place of Japan, right? It's essentially, I don't know what's useful for you, what Taiwanese people think about, I don't know, Diaoyu Island. It's just a minor thing. It's not that important. And for Japan, it was kind of this Eastern barbarians, really, almost. And yet they, of course, defeat them very decisively. And of course, they beat Russia, a major power, and began to be quickly a major industrial military power. So Japan becomes kind of, in a way, hated at one level, but also an entity that you could not ignore because it was obviously successful. You win wars, you build industrial products. When Korea, China, obviously Taiwan, Vietnam, they don't have much of this sort of thing. And most importantly, of course, it's the Japanese universities and intellectuals who translated many of these Western works. And of course, Chinese intellectuals did this too. But once they were translated into Japanese, they became easily accessible because they're written mainly in Chinese characters. I mean, if you read Japanese writing of late 19th century, right? Translations of Spencer or Montesquieu or whoever, it's basically like Chinese. It's 80%, maybe sometimes more, Chinese characters. So for Chinese intellectuals or Korean intellectuals, it was very easy to read. And so they become, even when they in turn translated from the Western languages, they often use Japanese sources. And this is partially because the government simply sent a lot of people, students, to the West, to Germany, to France, to England, even to the United States. And they became kind of the avant-garde, kind of the shock troop for importing Western ideas and thoughts. And of course, in turn, they feed Japan, that was to be a powerful political and economic entity in East Asia. So they in turn, of course, attract students from other East Asian countries. This is obviously true in the case of colonies like Taiwan and Korea, but it's actually true for other very important Chinese figures. Right? So if you think about just the profound impact, let's say someone like Liu Shen had on Chinese literature and kind of general thought in very early 20th century, it's hard to underestimate the impact of his time at Tohoku Daigaku, Tohoku University, studying these thoughts. And although he was, of course, trying to study medicine, to be a physician, he comes to realize, reading Japanese language works and so on, that what probably China needs more than another physician is kind of the physician of society, a social theorist, if you will. But the Japanese example, as I keep on suggesting, comes at a profound cost. Namely, that anything Japanese is basically ignored. And Japan thereby creates this culture of emulation, imitation, that even persists today. If you go to Japanese university, they still want you to translate. And introduction, shokai, becomes a very, very important intellectual achievement. If, for example, I, working in the U.S., if I were to translate Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Vietnamese work into English, people think I'm crazy because I'm wasting my time. But in Japan, even translating a minor thinker becomes a very important thing. And whoever gets to introduce that thinker or literature or novelist or whoever becomes a very important academic figure. Not someone who says something original, but someone who first brings outside ideas. And yet, what makes Japan even more relevant, more important, is that by adapting Western social sciences, by which I mean including history, modern historiography, political science, economics, legal science, legal studies, Japan actually ends up being the major country to study other East Asian countries. So for a long time, if you were studying Chinese history, not as much here, not as much in China, mainland China, but if you're studying for Chinese history in US, for example, or Europe, you only not have to learn Chinese, obviously, because you're going to be a historian of China, you have to know Chinese. But you actually have to have reading knowledge of Japanese. Why is that? Well, it's because many of the pioneering works of history about China were written by Japanese scholars, most famously at Kyoto University, but also elsewhere. The same thing was true, certainly for Korea. Almost every branch of knowledge about Korea, history, folklore, folk songs, they were pioneered by Japanese scholars. Sometimes associated with the government, general colonial government, sometimes associated with academics. But whatever the employment, it's that Japanese scholars really cultivated this new style of knowledge about the rest of East Asia. And finally, of course, colonialism does play a huge role, most obviously in Taiwan and Korea, but also parts of China as well. And the massive import of modernity, which was really Japanese modern. So everything from architecture, idea of what Western food was, the kind of clothing you wore, they come largely through the pipeline in Japan. So what happens in each East Asian society, I think, over time, and certainly this is very clear by early 20th century, is that you have dual structure, kind of a twofold structure. Essentially, the modernizing elites associated with government, business, and universities tend to become enslaved or enslaved to the Western ideas and discourses. So the whole problematic just simply becomes how we can catch up, how we can learn more and faster and get the latest from the West. Most easily through translation, of course, but ideally through studying abroad. You go to a German university, learn from Max Weber, for example, and bring back the latest thought to China, Japan, and Korea. Or more commonly, you went to Japan if you're in China or Korea, lesser extent Southeast Asia, because they had the best resources to teach you these things. They had bookstores, most famously a bookstore called Narizen, which was the greatest repository of the latest Western books in Japan. And it's through Narizen that very often these books came to China, Taiwan, Korea, and elsewhere. So basically what happens is that the elite universities become Westerns in character. And they took, because the whole foundation was that the West was better. Most obviously, in science, engineering, medicine. It was kind of obvious that they were much stronger. But in some ways, it was just as true in the humanities and the social sciences. So it's kind of interesting if you think about it. Even in fields of humanities, right, like Chinese philosophy, Chinese literature. I mean, if you ask a person on the street, a lay person, normal person, where would you go to study most about Chinese literature or philosophy? And most people would go to China, or if you're in Taiwan. But no, a lot of these scholars actually spent a lot of time studying in the West. And this enslavement was actually most acute in Japan and Korea, not as much in China for different reasons. But nonetheless, it was just an article of faith. It was religion, if you will, that the West was better. So the elites, educated elite, become Western. So what happens to the rest, or slightly non-elite intellectuals? What usually happens, curiously, in all societies in East Asia, and elsewhere actually throughout what we used to call the Third World, is that people create a different form of Western thought, but which they think is not really Western. That is to say, nationalism and nationalist discourse. It's the discourse that valorizes, right, values tradition. And they think that this is native or nativist, but in fact, of course, the very idea of the nation, nationalism, are all Western imports. And so they actually end up using Western categories, but putting national characteristics into this idea of tradition in the nation. So in each of the major East Asian societies, they create what I think of as very bizarre beliefs about each nation. So they take, for example, stories about the origin myth. This was worse in Japan. Actually, it was worse in Korea, I think. But and then they infuse it into nationalist framework. What I'm trying to say, maybe I'm clear, so I'll give you a very simple example. If you run into a Korean next and ask them about original Korean people, and there is myth about the origin of Korea they learned in school from these nationalists called Tangun. Tangun appears in the first kind of chronicle of Korean history, which was published around 1300. So it's actually very late. And what's very bizarre, it's a story about how a bear and tiger were living in a mountain and they wanted to be human, so a bear eats a lot of garlic and becomes a woman and has sex with a kind of godlike person and comes to these people who then become king of Korea. But what's bizarre about this mythology, of course it's a myth, so it's kind of crazy, but what's interesting is that it's just a story about the birth of the king of Korea. And so there were all these people living in Korea already, because you can't just be a king, you know. If you're just yourself, you're just, you know, you're not a king, you're just one person, right? But the story really is about how this king came to be and came to the Korean peninsula and got to be the king of Korea. So there were people in Korea already, right? But Koreans then think that this story is the origin of Korean people, period. And this is because the myth, which was only about a story about legitimating the kind of the sacred origin of Korean king during the Koryo dynasty, is put into the receptacle or the category of the nation. And you have to remember that the category of the nation really wasn't there in East Asia before 19th century. It didn't occur to Korean elites to think of the nation as a whole, in part because peasants were different kinds of people. They were just peasants. And worse, there were all these outcasts who weren't really even possibly human beings. And yet, because after the 19th century, East Asians import this national ideology in which everyone counts. It doesn't matter if you're a peasant or your ancestors were outcasts, you know, the lowest people, they're all part of the same nation state. So there's kind of an irony, I think, in nationalism in all East Asian societies, which think of itself as traditional and nativist, that it originates in each of these countries, in fact, is a modern idea that, of course, comes from the West. Okay, so it's a sad story in some way, but it's a very simple story, but I think it's unfortunately a true story. This thing comes from the West, completely overtakes much of East Asia in terms of thinking about social life or political life or economic life. But I want to suggest, though, that it's not only because there were no alternatives that the Western social theory became powerful. And what I want to suggest, actually, is that Western social theory becomes more and more convincing over time as each of the major East Asian areas become more and more like Western society. They begin to kind of look like society in this Western sense that Western social theory was describing. So social theory becomes more and more convincing as time goes on. What do I mean by that? Well, what I'm suggesting is that in pre-modern East Asia, before mid-19th century, the idea of Western social theory probably would have made no sense. Right? Because on the one hand, there was a very powerful view, Sinocentric, China-centric worldview, in which there was a simple hierarchy of civilizations. And everyone within it more or less kind of agreed about the worldview associated with Sinocentrism. In this context, social theory probably made very little sense, because the very idea that each society should have common language or religious belief or way of life would have made absolutely no sense. Because the fundamental principles of pre-modern status-based agrarian society, of course, was there were fundamental distinction between lords, powerful people, rich people, landlords, basically, and the peasants. They were just different kinds of people. And there were all these gradations among them. So the idea that you would generalize about them and think of them as the same kind of people was very foreign. Further,